All right, so the milling's all done, and this is what we're left with. So now I'll show you how I got here step by step, going through the milling process, planing, jointing, ripping to width, and then sanding and more sanding. So we're going to be milling the casings for 9 door jambs, which means we need a total of 18 side cases, 9 top casings, and then the crown piece, which is this little detail on the top. Casings and the top casings will both final dimension be 7/8, whereas this crown on the top final dimension will be 1 inch. Now, it just happens that all of the rough stock that we're going to be milling up is starting at 5/4 dimension. And for those of you who don't know, when buying rough stock, everything is dimensioned in quarters. So 4/4 is 1 inch stock, 5/4 would be 1.25 inches, etc., etc. The reason why you always go heavy on the stock is because the rough cut lumber has twist in it. The board itself is going to have tension in it. So as you mill wood off, it's going to tend to warp. So you always want to go at least 1/4 inch heavier on your rough stock than you're planning for your final stock. So in this case, all of our rough stock is 5/4 because our final dimensions are between 7/8 and 1 inch. To start the process, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go through a process called skip planing. Skip planing is simply, we're going to take this board, we're going to run it through the planer with one face up, we're going to flip it over, run it through the planer with the other face up, and we're going to keep flipping the board back and forth. Should get us with 2 parallel sides. Now, skip planing is really only effective if you're taking off small amounts on each side, because to get both sides of the board right now are not parallel, they're not coplanar. So by running it through the planer, even though the planer is taking a smooth cut, it's referencing off of an uneven surface on the bottom. And each time we take a cut, the surface gets a little bit more even. So the more cuts we're able to take on each side, the more parallel and the more coplanar the board will end up in. I'm going to set the planer for exactly 1.25 inches, and we'll see how it goes. Again, the dimension of the boards are 5/4, which should be 1.25 inches, but some of them are going to have cupping in it, or twist, which effectively, if you have a cupped board sitting on a perfectly flat surface, the apex of that cup is going to be higher than the overall thickness of the board. And this is white oak, so it's extremely hard. So we don't want to overtax the planer. So we'll set it right at 1.25, and we'll run some boards through, and we'll make sure we're listening. And if it sounds like we're taking too much off, or we're being too aggressive, or on the outside, if the cut looks a little too rough, we'll increase the height a little bit, and we'll run everything through just a couple extra times to get down to the final dimension that we need. Okay, so we've gotten through 2 passes, 1 pass on each side of the boards for most part. Some of them had the second pass on the same side. As you could tell, kind of a time-consuming process. We have 26 boards, 8 feet long, so we're talking about 175 linear feet or so of lumber that needs to be milled. So this is the final product after the skip planing. And you can see we have one very nice, smooth, clean surface. And then if I flip these over, we have another very nice, smooth, clean surface. We ended up with boards that now have 2 perfectly parallel sides. There were a couple of boards where there was a bit of a bow running the length of the board, and ultimately what we've ended up with now is we have a board with 2 sides that are both parallel to one another, but unfortunately there's a slight curve in the overall length of the board. Since these boards are going to be used for the side casing of door trim, that's not going to matter, because when they get nailed into the door frame, it's going to suck them right into the door, and it's really going to make no difference at all. If I was using these boards to make a tabletop or a desktop or anything like that, then I wouldn't use this method. I would have used the jointer to flatten one side, and then I would have planed the other side, and that would have completely removed that bend in the board. But for this application, it really doesn't make a difference. We're going to joint one edge of the board now, which is going to give us a perfectly square edge, which is going to serve as a reference guide when we run the boards through the table saw. So I'll start that process now. So one tip when you're running boards through the jointer, you don't want to have any downward pressure pushing the board down against the cutter head. You want all your pressure to be back against the back reference side. The idea here is you don't want to force any flex out of the board. You want the board to go across the cutter with no additional stress on it, so that the machine can do what it's designed to do, which is bring that edge down to a perfectly flat surface. Any additional downward force is going to be flexing the board as it engages that cutter, and then when it comes off the other side, it's going to pop back once that force is released, and then you're going to be left with a bow in your board, and you're not going to have that perfectly jointed surface you were looking for. All right, we just finished up the jointing process, and this is what we're left with. So as you can see, we have a nice, clean edge that's a perfect right angle to our reference edge, which in this case is the face that is down right now. And if you look right down there, any inconsistency is just my stacking. But we have what is now almost a perfect stack of boards, as if you were to buy S4S lumber directly from the lumberyard. S4S stands for surfaced on 4 sides. Of course, we only have 3 sides done. We have 1 more side to go. Okay, so I finished going through the stack of lumber. I picked out all the boards that I want to use for my side casing, picking the boards with the straightest grain, and also making sure that I was using my narrower stock for those, for the side casing, since those are only going to be 4-inch finish diameter. And then for my top casing, I was picking out the boards with more figure, more stuff going on in the grain, so that it's a little bit more pronounced on that 6-inch pattern. And again, I did try to leverage those to my wider boards. And in those cases, those wider boards, I'm also cutting the crown, the cap, the casing cap piece, that's the little decorative trim piece on the top, out of those larger boards. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my table saw to start ripping the boards down to their final dimension, or close to their final dimension. I'm going to be about a 32nd heavy to account for the final sanding that I'll do on the edges. So this should be the fastest of the milling procedures we've done so far. Just to give you a bit of reference, the skip planing took 3 hours, but I did have lunch in there, so probably more like 2.5 hours. The jointing took in total, I would say, 1.5 hours, and the cutting to final dimension on the table saw here probably shouldn't take more than 30 minutes. The reason for the longer times on the planer specifically is you're limited to the feed speed of the planer, and if we're trying to take the least amount on each pass to get, the maximum number of passes on each side. That time obviously starts to add up per board foot fed through the machine. All right, so let's get started ripping these down to sides. Okay, I just finished ripping all of the side casings and what will become the headers and the crowns to their final width. The last step in the milling process now is to bring the side cases and the header case down to 7/8 of an inch. So I got to go take another couple passes through the planer again. The crown piece is already at its final thickness of 1 inch. So we'll throw these through the planer one last time. And I figured I'd spare everybody another 30 seconds of footage of me running boards through the planer. Here I'm cutting the top casings down to their final lengths. There was a couple of inclusions in the boards that I didn't think were going to stain up all that well, so I just decided to cut around them. After I finished cutting the top casings to final length, I did the same procedure for the crown piece as well as the side casings. Again, cutting around any inclusions, and particularly for the side casings, I was cutting off the ends with the snipe from the planer as well as a bit of checking. Okay, so we're breaking out the sander here, so we must be getting close to the finish line of the milling process here. I'm going to set up the drum sander by raising the throat until the board just fits underneath it. And then I'm going to slowly lower it down again while spinning the drum, just until the drum kisses the top of the wood. At that point, I'll back it off a full turn, pull the board back out, and then bring it back down a full turn. This is super important because if you're too aggressive with the drum sander, especially when you have a higher grit sandpaper on it, it's just going to burn up the paper and gum it up and put burn marks onto your wood rather than removing the milling marks that you're trying to remove from prior operations. So real important to not get aggressive with the drum sander with high grit sandpapers on it. And here I'm using 120 grit basically to help me out with my final sanding. So this is just another little trick that I use to help myself out. I mark the starting position and the ending position on the sander because I only move it down in 64th increments. It's real easy as you're going to forget where you are, so having it marked on the machine, your starting and stopping positions, really saves you from making a mistake and having to redo something or throw something out because you've gone too far. And now I'm just going to run all of my stock through the drum sander. The crown piece will get run through on all 4 sides. The top case will get run through on one side, the face showing, and the side cases will also all get run through on one side. It came out perfect. Literally perfect. Okay, so now we're all done with drum sanding. All we have left to do at this point is break out the orbital sander and do a lot of sanding. All right, I'm gonna be clamping up everything in billets to make it easier to sand. The main point of using the billet is if I just did this on an individual piece, the sander is going to want to roll over the edges like this. If I use the billet, I get the balance of all of the pieces, which is going to keep the sander nice and flat. allow me to apply more even pressure and end up with a better finished surface. But more importantly, it's a hell of a lot faster because instead of sanding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 individual pieces, I'm going to sand it as one piece. So that takes it down to 1/8 of the time that it would have taken me, and I don't have to go through the balancing act of the, trying to balance the sander on the edge. So all the faces that needed to be sanded on these crowns are already down to 120 grit. I'm going to hit them with 180 grit and then 220 grit for the final finish, and I'm going to do that on every single side of these crowns. On the door headers, the face of the board is already at 120 grit. That will get sanded at 180 and 220 as well. And then as for the edges of it, I actually only need to sand one edge because the other edge is going to be covered by the cap. But we'll do the same thing. We'll clamp everything together, make a big billet, sand them all at once, and then as far as the end grain, it's going to be the same thing. Like, I took my time to line up the end grain. See it here. I took my time to line this up. So as I'm going through the process of sanding this billet, I'll also sand the end grain. Obviously, we have the shorter crown right there. That one I will have to pull out and do separate. I intentionally left it in on both ends to do that one as a separate piece. Okay, let's get started. Just wanted to take a minute to talk about the sander because the sander is going to make a huge difference in how quick you're able to get the sanding done and then therefore how enjoyable it is. So this is a Makita BO 6050. It's a 6-inch orbital sander, and it has the ability to both do fully random orbital, but it also has the ability to lock the spindle, which means it can get super, super aggressive. Basically, that's the same feature as the Festool Rotex, which makes it so good. The difference between this and the Festool is this cost about half, and the reason for that is the compromise is it's not balanced as well. So you'll notice when this sits down, it actually tilts backwards. Most of the weight's in the back. Even if I disconnected the vacuum, it's not going to change how it's sitting. The Festool would actually sit upright. So all that means is it takes a little more effort to keep it flat because the tool doesn't naturally want to stay flat by itself. But overall, for the amount I use it for and for the price difference, this was the way to go. The other thing that I found that makes a huge, huge difference are these sanding discs. So these are Mirka Abernet disc. They're a little pricey, but the benefit of them is there's no individual holes in the disc. Let me get another sample here. So this is like your standard disc, and you can see you have the cutouts for the dust to flow through. These Mirka ones, the entire disc is a hole. It's actually a net, and this works really well on clearing out all the dust. There's virtually no dust while I'm sanding right now. Everything is coming up through the sander and going into the dust collector. That does two things. One, I'm not breathing in the dust, but two, it's getting the dust off the work surface, which is allowing the sandpaper to do a more effective job of sanding. Basically, what that means is quicker sanding. So my audio cut out here, but what I was trying to explain is on the longer side casing pieces, the wood did flex a little bit as it was settling after the milling process. So the boards weren't lining up perfectly. They were about a 32nd of a 1/16 of an inch off in some cases. So here I was just putting some clamping cauls across the boards to bring them all into the same plane before I went ahead and clamped them all together. If I had skipped this step, I would have been in for a lot of sanding, and I would have actually been taking the boards out of square. So it was real important, since I wanted to sand all these as one billet, that I bring them all into alignment first before I started the sanding process. All right, we finally made it to the last step of the milling process, which is going to be to add a 1/4 inch round over to both sides of each of the side casings, as well as both ends of the top casing, and on the top cap, the little crown trim piece, that's going to get a round over on both ends, as well as all the way across the top. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with my trim router and a 1/4 inch round over bit. So this is it, the final step of the milling process. Here I am hand sanding the roundovers that I had just routed on with a bit of 220 sandpaper, and then coming back with the orbital sander, again at 220 to just touch up the face. It may seem like this was slightly out of order to do the roundovers after I did the bulk of the sanding, but doing the roundovers after made it a lot easier to edge sand all of the pieces. And no matter which way I had done it, I would have always had to come back and hand sand the edges with the contour pad anyway. So there really was no loss of time doing it this way. If anything, it made it easier to do all of the edge sanding, allowing me to do that very quickly with the orbital sander, rather than having to spend more time hand sanding. All right, so the milling's all done, and this is what we're left with. It's a little hard to balance it here on my my table because it's a little small, but you get the idea of what we were going for. You could see there's all the side casings. I have a bunch of the top casings and crown casings over there, and in the other room I've actually already started to finish a bunch more that I had. And speaking of finish, I'm going to be staining this, as I said earlier. I'm going to be using General Finishes gel stain. I'll put 2 coats of gel stain on, wiping off any excess on each coat, and then I'm going to go ahead and apply 4 to 5 coats of a water-based polyurethane. In this case, I'm just using a Minwax, and the finish that I'll use on that is I'll just use a satin finish rather than a gloss. What that's going to do is that's going to let the wood grain pop a little bit more, and you won't have any of that shimmer because of the poly itself. That said, I'm not going to show any of the finishing process itself. To give you an idea of what I've already got done, I have those floor trim right there, and then I have all of those, which is a combination of floor trim and additional side casings, and there's some headers sorry, excuse me, top cases and crown caps down on the bottom. So now that I have everything all milled up, over the next week or so, I'm going to work on getting it finished. And then probably in 2 weeks, I'll get everything installed, and I'll have another video on the installation, going through some tips on how to cut perfect miters, coming around corners both inside and outside, as well as odd angles. But I'll go through all that in the next video, as well as a couple of really cheap tools that can help you get the miters perfect. All right, everybody. Thank you for watching along. If you like this, please hit subscribe and hit the thumbs up button. Just so you know, this is obviously a new channel. I am trying to put out a new content every 2 weeks. So my goal is 24 videos for a year. So far, I think I'm gonna make it, but I don't want to jinx myself yet. But I will have another video coming out in a week and a half, and that will be on installing a wall safe and making it a hidden safe, putting a picture over it to make it disappear. So if you like this, and if home improvement projects and woodworking is something you're interested in, please subscribe. Thank you.